أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وأصحابه المنتجبين ما بعد. Assalamu alaikum. Today I'm going to speak about a topic that we're all very familiar with, and is dealing with hardship. And basically I decided to speak about this topic. I know it's already been discussed plenty of times from this minbar and through many other lectures, but I wanted to speak about it for a number of reasons. First of all, speaking about such topics serves as a reminder not only for myself but for all of us, because sometimes in our life when we're busy and we're preoccupied, we forget some of our basic tenets, some of our basic beliefs, and we have to be reminded. And we're constantly on a journey, and we are constantly in a struggle with heedlessness, with forgetfulness, and therefore it's always important to be served reminders. Secondly, there's been in recent times a decline in spirituality, in that nowadays we see from not only within the Muslim communities, but also many faith communities are having a crisis of faith. And one of the reasons that is often cited for this is the fact that hardships occur. And many people argue that, for example, how can a God that is so merciful and so forgiving and so perfect would allow for such hardships to occur in this world? And therefore it's led to a crisis of faith. And an example of this you can see, for example, in popular culture, we see the figure of Stephen Fry, who is a comedian and an actor. And he often cites as one of his reasons for not believing in God the fact that there are children in, for example, a place like Africa who are suffering from illnesses which cause, for example, their eyelids to wear away. And he cites this as a reason for him not believing in God. And therefore, we need to ask a question as to what is the purpose of these hardships, and what kind of hardships can we face in our day-to-day lives, and how do we respond to them? And when I was thinking about this topic, the first verse that came to mind, and I apologize in advance if this has already been covered before, but like I said, it's always good to have reminders. But the first verse that came to mind was the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse number 155, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in this verse that we will afflict you with hardships, and he gives examples of these hardships. So, for example, there is fear, there's hunger, there's the loss of property, lives and fruits, and give glad tidings to those that are patient. And it's interesting because when I was looking at this verse, I decided to look at the verses surrounding it to see whether there's more context to this. And it's interesting because when you look at the verses preceding and the verses afterwards as well, we see that there's like a theme that is being run here within the Quran, and the verses seem to be interlinked, and there seems to be like a general advice being given here, a series of advice being given here when faced with hardship and difficulties. Secondly, it's also important for us when looking at these verses to understand the context, because when I first thought about this topic, I had an idea in mind, but then when I looked at the tafsir literature, for example, Allama Tabatabai in his Al-Mizan, he discusses how these 5 verses, so from verse 153 to 157, they're all interlinked and they're all important, and they were all revealed within one context. And he says that that context was in the context of jihad. So he says that the early Muslims were faced with a number of difficulties. They were a small community. They were facing difficulties from their enemies in the form of the Quraysh, and they were about to embark on a series of battles. And therefore these verses were revealed in order for these individuals to be prepared for the hardship that they're going to go through, and for God to list the kind of hardship that they will face and the responses that they should give in these circumstances. And therefore, although these verses are specific to that context, we can also take lesson from these verses and apply it to ourselves. Now, before I continue, it'd be important to now understand the verses that are in question. So, starting from verse 153, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and this is a very famous verse, all of these verses we would have heard time and time again. Allah says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu ista'inu bis-sabri was-salat, inna Allaha ma'as sabirin. He says that all you who believe, seek help through patience and prayer. Indeed, Allah is with the patient. And then the next verse goes on to say, وَلَا تَقُولُوا لِمَنْ يُقْتَلُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتٌ بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ وَلَكِنْ لَا تَشْعُرُونَ. We've heard this verse repeated a number of times in various lectures. And this verse is saying that don't think of those that have been killed in the way of Allah as dead. No, they are alive, but you do not perceive. And this verse in particular is highlighting for that early community of Muslims that they won't die if they were to lose their life through these hardships, but they will enter into a phase called barzakh, and they will still continue to be alive. And then we come to the verse that I recited earlier, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ. And then after this, you see the verse saying, what it says, الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. So those who, when affliction befalls them, they say, indeed we belong to Allah and to Him we will return. And then finally the passage of verses ends with أُولَٰئِكَ عَلَيْهِمْ صَلَوَاتٌ مِّن رَبِّهِمْ وَرَحْمَةٌ وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُهْتَدُونَ. Allah says that on them is my blessings and my peace, and they are the ones who are rightly guided. Now, all of these verses are important because they lay out for us, when we are reading it in today's context, they lay out for us a series of things. Firstly, it outlines some of the challenges that we might face. And secondly, it outlines how to respond to these trials. And it also identifies one key aspect that we must keep in mind when approaching life and when having a worldview. And I'm going to elaborate on these further. So first of all, what are the challenges? Some of the challenges that we might face is fear. We may face fear in our lives from approaching problems that we may face. So sometimes we see that people think about some of the fears that they have in terms of their job, in terms of their children, in terms of their livelihood and their income, especially when we think about today's context with the pandemic that just happened, and then now the crisis with people suffering with their gas bills and increasing inflation. We see that people are constantly going through trials and tribulations. And this is causing them to have a decrease in not only their properties, but to have experienced fear. For example, they might experience even hunger, and they may face other difficulties that may be in the form of losing loved ones, losing children, losing fruits, whether that may be their businesses or their livelihoods. And therefore, we have to be aware that these are the kind of trials and tests that we will face. And Allah gives us a few advices. He says sabr 3 times in these passages, in these 5 verses. So we need to exercise patience. Sometimes when we go through difficulties, we're panicking, we're lost, we don't know how to respond to a situation. But then we see some people that are completely calm in the most difficult of circumstances. So for example, I've seen in the past, some people, when they're updating their phone, for example, they lose a few WhatsApp messages, and those people, they become almost inconsolable. They're almost in tears. And it's a very superficial and artificial thing, but they're getting so emotional over the loss of just a few messages. But then on the opposite side, we see people, for example, who may have even lost property. They may have even been robbed, but they think about the fact that these possessions that they have, they ultimately don't belong to them. Secondly, the other thing that I want to highlight here was this verse of istirja, where Allah says, Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Sometimes we say this when people have passed away, and unfortunately we lose the meaning of what this actually means. we see even now when people pass away, people abbreviate this term and they'll say ILWIR. They abbreviate it and forget the meaning of what they're actually saying. But Allah tells us to think about this. Why? Because He's explained to us that within this verse He says, Inna lillah, that we belong to Allah. Sometimes when we face losses in our lives, we feel it more because we feel that these are our possessions, these are our things. This is my car, this is my house, these are my children, this is my body. Why am I going through illnesses, for example? Why am I going through suffering? But if we were to understand this verse in its totality, and we were to understand the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Malik and we are the Mamluk, He is the owner and we are the owned. If we were to understand these subtle points within these verses, then we would have a completely different outlook in life. We would have a different worldview, and we would have a different approach entirely to when we face hardships. And then what we would realize is that these hardships are an opportunity for us to grow, an opportunity for us to reflect upon God and to understand that these things that are in our lives, they're all perishing, and that they ultimately we don't own any of these things. And this aspect of ownership is very important for us to understand, because many of us don't understand it fully, and then this is what causes us pain and hardship. And if I were to give you a comparison, if you were to think about some of the things that we own, let's say, for example, a house. Many of us may have a house, we may have a house on mortgage, but imagine now we had an individual who had a house on rent, and they had a house on rent for, say, a few years, and then they decided that after a few years, I'm going to leave this house and perhaps move to another city. If that individual were to say that, no, I don't want to leave this house, they started to get emotional, they started to cry and, pull a tantrum, for example, people would laugh at this individual and say, why are you so attached to these things? Because ultimately, you don't own them. You're basically a renter. You don't own this property. You are just here for a short period of time and another individual will come. So why are you taking such, why are you getting so emotional about these things? But unfortunately, we see this in our day-to-day lives where we become so attached to our possessions, things that we believe that we possess, but ultimately we don't. And therefore we get emotional and upset about these situations. Now, finally, given that it is the ayam of Lady Fatima al-Zahra, salamullah alayha, salawat, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. I just thought I'd give a few words, very brief words, just about a few aspects of her life and how she went through hardship, but that these hardships that she went through helped to refine her and helped her to become the lady that is recognized as the Lady of Light, the mistress of the women of the world. And we just have to look at a couple of examples in her life. So first of all, when the Prophet was preaching about Islam in his early days and he was prostrating towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in public, his enemies would come forward and they would slash the camel and open the guts of the camel and pour the insides of the camel onto the head of the Prophet whilst he was in sujood. And we would see that Lady Fatima would go to the Prophet and she would help to clean away this mess. And then on another occasion, we see, for example, in certain battlefields, for example, in Uhud, when people ran away from the side of the Prophet because there was some confusion, we see that Lady Fatima was there to attend to the wounds of her father, the multiple wounds that were afflicted on his body. So we see that she went through a number of hardships. She lost her mother at a young age, and yet despite this, she used her hardships as an opportunity to grow, as an opportunity to better herself. And this example from these verses are example for us all to try and seek a lesson from our hardships, as opposed to being complacent too much and bearing patience and seeking help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wal asr, inna al-insana lafi khusr, illa alladhina amanu wa amilu as-salihat, wa tawasaw bil-haqq, wa tawasaw bis-sabr. Allahumma salli. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. أوصيكم عباد الله وأوصي نفسي بتقوى الله. So in the first half of the khutbah, we spoke about different hardships that we may face. And sometimes we forget the wisdom of these difficulties and these trials that we have in our lives. And within the verses that we spoke about previously, we can see that through difficulties, there's a potential for us to become those that are the muhtadun, those that are the guided ones, and those that receive the blessings and the peace of Allah on us if we were to utilize these hardships properly. Therefore, by going through hardships, it's a means for our soul to evolve, our soul to grow, and by undergoing these struggles, we have this potential and this capacity towards greater things. And through these hardships, we can perhaps have a renewed mindset, a mindset that gives us positivity in our day-to-day lives when dealing with difficulties. And if we look at, for example, in our day-to-day lives, we can see many examples of individuals who have gone through difficulties, many individuals in the world of sport, in the world of science, entrepreneurs, activists, who have gone through a number of difficulties and challenges in their lives. And these challenges have helped them to become the individual that they are today. So although many of you may be interested in football, but I apologize to people who aren't. I'm going to use the example of, for example, the polarizing figure of Cristiano Ronaldo. So in his life, he explains how he lost his father at a young age and how he went through poverty and difficulty and was raised by a single mother and was even laughed and bullied at. And despite this, he ends up becoming one of the greatest footballers of all time. And it's interesting that when he discusses his son, he was once asked about his son and whether he thinks he has the potential to be like him. He said that perhaps he has the potential, but I fear that he has grown up in privilege. He has grown up in comfort, whereas because I went through hardship, that gave me the motivation to become who I am today. And therefore, these hardships and these difficulties that we go through have this potential and have this capacity for us to become better. And it's with this that I wanted to discuss a slightly separate issue, because sometimes I think it's important for us to discuss contemporary issues, because from these platforms, sometimes people will say that there are certain taboo issues that we shouldn't speak about. There are certain issues that are off limits when it comes to the minbar. But in our context, we do need to discuss important issues that affect all of us or affect many people, and they are suffering in silence. And one of the hardships that people face is, and which has been highlighted in the verses that I spoke about earlier, is the loss of lives. And in particular, what I wanted to speak about is the loss of children. So sometimes what people do is that hardships can go either one of two ways. We can either grow from them, or we can become resentful towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for giving this. So for example, you hear people say that, why me? Why has God chosen me to go through this difficulty, despite the fact that I might come to the mosque on a regular basis, despite the fact that I may pray on a regular basis? Why has it happened to me? And unfortunately, for some people, they believe in our communities, and it still exists today, that some of these hardships are a sign of God's wrath on these individuals. And this can be seen especially when it comes to the loss of children. So even speaking from a personal point of view, a few years ago, I experienced the loss of a child through miscarriage. My wife had a miscarriage. And at that time, because I hadn't heard about it much, it wasn't seen to be as, I didn't realize how prevalent it was in society. And then only afterwards, I realized so many stories of people who had gone through this difficulty. But then not just that, there's so many people who, for example, have issues with having children. There are people within our communities that never have children in their lifetime, or there are people who are mocked because of this. And I've even spoken to friends and family friends as well who have told me about situations that they've been through. And whereby when, for example, they've been in a community, some people have pointed out a particular couple who have been married for a certain number of years, and they said that, or these people perhaps are not blessed by God because they don't have children. Some kind of backwards mentalities that are out there are quite shocking for people to hear, but this is the reality that some people face, that some people are almost seen as almost like untouchables, that they, stay away from them, they're cursed individuals because they don't have children, for example. But we can see that hardships can be there for God to refine his servant, to bring that servant closer to him. And unfortunately, we see that, for example, particularly in the subcontinent communities, as soon as a young couple is married, within a week of them being married, the couples are being asked whether they're expecting children. This is the kind of pressure that people are being put under. And what makes it worse is when you have people who are genuinely going through difficulties. And I know of a number of cases of people who have been married for a number of years, and people are constantly being putting pressure on them. And it's causing them a lot of distress and a lot of harm and difficulties. So not only do we need to look towards spiritual means to help us in these calamities and hardships, but we also should look at means through our societies and through ourselves by being compassionate towards other people, by being understanding towards other people, and not giving these harsh comments to other people. And we see this, for example, especially when it comes to the loss of children through miscarriages, such a common problem that people face. So we see that, for example, 1 in 5 women, after having such a like a miscarriage, they go through depression, they go through post-traumatic stress disorder, and 1 in 12 men are even affected by this. And therefore, it's important for us to show compassion, but then also understand that each of us are on our own unique journeys towards God, and we may be tested in various different ways, and these aren't necessarily bad things or should be seen in a negative light, but perhaps these could be a means for that individual to have refinement and proximity to God. And finally, I just wanted to end with a beautiful poem that has been taken from the Diwan of Imam Ali alayhi salam, and that was shared by us with Dr. Wahid, so I want to give him credit for this. But it's a beautiful Diwan, and it kind of summarizes what has been said already and has been attributed to Amir al-Mu'mineen. So it says, ليس البلية في أيامنا عجبا بل السلامة فيها أعجب العجب ليس الجمال بأثواب تزيننا إن الجمال جمال العقل والأدب ليس اليتيم الذي قد مات والده إن اليتيم يتيم العلم والأدب. And it basically translates as, tribulation in our lifetime is not peculiar. Rather, safety from it is the most remarkable of oddities. Beauty is not in our adorning of garments. Truly, beauty is the elegance of intellect and etiquettes. The orphan is not one whose father has departed. Indeed, the estranged is one deprived of wisdom and refinement. And finally, I just wanted to end by taking this time to remember those who are suffering from illnesses, and to remember those, especially our marhumeen, and those from amongst our teachers, especially who have gone through some difficulties and have had some losses in their families recently, such as Sayyid Fatimi, Dr. Fanai, Dr. Bujani. But also we want to remember all of our marhumeen with Surah Al-Fatiha ma'a salawat. Allahumma salli ala